Summer, 1942. German soldiers on the Eastern Front reported something terrifying. Every night they'd hear a strange sound, like wind through fabric, or a witch's broomstick cutting through the air. Then silence, then explosions. The Germans called them Nachthexen, night witches. Soviet female pilots flying outdated biplanes made of plywood and canvas. Planes so primitive they didn't even have radios. So slow that German fighters couldn't shoot them down without stalling their own engines. But these women flew 30,000 combat missions, dropped 23,000 tons of bombs. Some pilots flew 18 missions in a single night, taking off, bombing, landing, refueling, and doing it again, and again, and again. The Germans were so terrified of them that they offered automatic Iron Cross medals, Germany's highest military honour, to any pilot who shot down just one night witch. This is the story of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, the most decorated female military unit in history, and why the Germans feared them more than Soviet tanks. June 1941. Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers, 3,000 tanks, and 2,000 aircraft smashed into the Soviet Union. Within months, the Red Army was in catastrophic retreat. Millions of Soviet soldiers killed or captured. Entire armies encircled and destroyed. The Luftwaffe dominated Soviet skies. Stalin was desperate. The Soviet Union was losing the war badly, and in that desperation, Stalin made a decision that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. He authorized the formation of all-female combat aviation regiments, not support roles, not nursing, combat, flying bombers and fighters against the Luftwaffe. In 1941, when women in most countries couldn't even vote or own property in their own names, the Soviet Union was about to put them in combat aircraft with orders to kill German soldiers. This wasn't progressive enlightenment, this was desperation. The Soviet Union needed every pilot it could get, but there was one woman who'd been pushing for this long before the war made it necessary. Marina Raskova was a Soviet aviation hero. In 1938, she'd set the world record for longest non-stop flight by a woman, over 6,000 kilometers. She was famous, respected, and had Stalin's ear. When the war started, Raskova received thousands of letters from Soviet women, pilots, mechanics, engineers, begging to be allowed to fight. Women who could fly but were told to stay home. Women who watched their country burn while they were forbidden to defend it. Raskova took these letters to Stalin himself. She proposed creating 3 all-female aviation regiments: a fighter regiment, a dive bomber regiment, and a night bomber regiment. Stalin, facing military catastrophe, agreed. In October 1941, the order went out. The Soviet Air Force would form 3 regiments staffed entirely by women, not just pilots, navigators, mechanics, armourers, ground crew, everyone. No men allowed. Within weeks, over 2,000 women volunteered. They came from across the Soviet Union. University students, factory workers, teenage girls lying about their age, experienced pilots and complete novices, all of them willing to die to defend their country. The training was brutal. These women weren't given special treatment or easier standards. They trained exactly like male pilots. They studied navigation, aircraft mechanics, bombing procedures and combat tactics. They learned to fly in formation, navigate by stars, and hit targets in complete darkness. Many washed out. Some died in training accidents, but those who made it through became some of the most skilled pilots in the Soviet Air Force. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment, later renamed the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, was formed under the command of Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya. Their assigned aircraft, the Polikarpov Po-2, a biplane designed in 1928 as a crop duster and training aircraft. Maximum speed, 94 miles per hour, made of plywood and canvas stretched over a wooden frame. Open cockpit with no protection from wind, cold, or enemy fire, no radio, no guns initially, though some crews mounted rear-facing machine guns later. No parachutes, they took up too much weight and space. No armour, no self-sealing fuel tanks. One bullet in the fuel tank, and the entire plane would go up in flames. The Po-2 was laughably outdated even by 1941 standards. The Germans were flying Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters that could reach 350 miles per hour, modern bombers with enclosed cockpits, defensive armament and armour protection. And here were Soviet women being told to fly against them in wooden biplanes that belonged in a museum. But as these women would prove, sometimes obsolete technology combined with brilliant tactics beats superior equipment. Sometimes the underdog has advantages no one expects. The Po-2's weaknesses became its strengths through clever tactics. The plane was so slow that German fighters couldn't engage it effectively. A Messerschmitt trying to slow down enough to target a Po-2 would risk stalling, losing lift and potentially crashing. German anti-aircraft gunners were trained to lead fast-moving targets. They'd aim ahead of where the aircraft was, anticipating its speed, but the Po-2 flew so slowly that gunners would consistently overshoot. They literally couldn't adjust to something moving that slowly. But the real genius of the Night Witch's tactics was how they used the Po-2's simplicity. The plane had minimal metal parts, which meant it barely registered on German radar. In darkness, these wooden planes were almost invisible to electronic detection. And then there was the sound, or rather, the absence of it. Here's how a typical Night Witch mission worked. The regiment would receive targets, German supply depots, artillery positions, troop concentrations, command posts. Each crew, pilot and navigator, would load their Po-2 with bombs. The maximum payload was only about 350 kilograms, so they carried small bombs, usually 4 to 6 per aircraft. Then they'd take off into darkness. They flew low, sometimes as low as 300 feet above the ground, in complete darkness, with no instruments beyond a compass and altimeter, navigating by visual landmarks and dead reckoning. When they approached the target, the pilot would cut the engine. In the sudden silence, the only sound was wind whistling through the canvas and wooden struts of the biplane. That's the sound German soldiers heard, like fabric tearing through the air, like a witch on a broomstick. The Germans would panic, trying to locate the source of the sound in the darkness. Searchlights sweeping the sky, anti-aircraft guns firing blindly. And then the Po-2 would glide over the target, completely silent except for that whistling sound. The navigator, sitting in the rear cockpit with a primitive bomb sight, would release the bombs manually. Then the pilot would restart the engine and climb away as the bombs exploded below. By the time the Germans organised a response, the Po-2 was gone, disappeared into darkness. And then another one would come, and another, afoot all night long. And the Night Witches developed a particularly effective technique. They'd send 3 planes toward a target. 2 would deliberately draw searchlights and anti-aircraft fire, flying in different directions, creating confusion. The 3rd would cut its engine and glide in silently from another direction, dropping bombs while the Germans were distracted. Then they'd rotate. The bombardier would become the decoy. The decoy would attack. Constant harassment, never giving the Germans a moment of rest. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers reported more fear of the Night Witches than of larger Soviet bomber formations. Because you could hear the big bombers coming, you could see them on radar, you could shoot at them. But the Night Witches, they were invisible, silent, and then suddenly bombs were falling. You couldn't predict when they'd come. You couldn't see them. You couldn't effectively defend against them. Night after night, every night. German soldiers started calling any nighttime harassment those damned women. The sound of canvas wings in darkness became a sound of terror. Some Night Witch pilots flew 15 to 18 missions in a single night. They'd land, ground crews would refuel and rearm the plane in minutes, and they'd take off again. One pilot, Nadezhda Popova, flew over 850 combat missions during the war. 850 times she took off into darkness with bombs, navigated to German positions and attacked. Another pilot, Irina Sebrova, flew 1,008 missions, more combat missions than any other female pilot in history. These women weren't flying one dangerous mission and going home. They were doing it multiple times every single night for years. The physical toll was immense. They flew in open cockpits in Russian winter, temperatures dropping to minus 30 or 40 degrees Celsius. They'd land after missions with frostbite on their faces, ice in their hair, so cold they couldn't climb out of the cockpit without help. They flew in summer too, when they'd return covered in mosquito bites from flying through swarms of insects at low altitude. They flew through storms, through anti-aircraft fire, through whatever conditions existed, because the war didn't stop for weather. And they flew in planes that could be destroyed by a single bullet. The canvas covering would catch fire instantly. The wooden frame would disintegrate. There were no parachutes. If your plane was hit, you died. You didn't bail out. You went down with the aircraft. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, the Night Witches developed a fierce esprit de corps. They were all women, fighting in a war that didn't want them, proving themselves every single night. They cut their hair short because long hair was impractical in open cockpits. They wore oversized men's uniforms because the Soviet Air Force didn't make women's sizes. Their boots were often too big, so they stuffed them with newspaper or cloth. They looked ragged and exhausted, but they kept flying. And the Germans kept dying. By late 1942, the Night Witches had become such an effective harassment force that the German command took an extraordinary step. They announced that any Luftwaffe pilot who shot down a Po-2 would automatically receive the Iron Cross. This is significant. The Iron Cross was Germany's highest military decoration. Normally it required extraordinary valor or significant achievement. Shooting down one enemy aircraft, especially an obsolete biplane, wouldn't typically qualify, but the Germans made an exception for the Night Witches. This tells you everything about how much they feared these women. Think about what this means from a military psychology standpoint. The German High Command was admitting that these Soviet women in wooden planes were enough of a threat that they needed special incentives to encourage German pilots to engage them. But there was a practical problem. Shooting down a Po-2 was incredibly difficult. German fighters were designed to hunt bombers at high altitude and high speed. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 had a stall speed, the speed below which it lost lift and fell from the sky, that was higher than the Po-2's maximum speed. A German pilot trying to slow down enough to stay behind a Po-2 was in constant danger of stalling. Some German pilots tried diving attacks, coming from above at high speed, making one firing pass, then climbing away. But the Po-2 was small and agile. It could turn inside the German fighter's turning radius. By the time the German pilot set up for another pass, the Po-2 had often disappeared into darkness. Other German tactics were equally ineffective. Searchlights would try to illuminate the Po-2 for anti-aircraft guns, but the plane was so small and flying so low that it was nearly impossible to keep illuminated. Ground fire would sometimes bring down a Po-2, but more often the plane would slip away in the darkness. The Luftwaffe eventually developed a specific tactic for night witch hunting. They'd position fighters at known approaches to Soviet airfields, trying to catch the Po-2s during takeoff or landing when they were most vulnerable and couldn't maneuver effectively. This worked sometimes. The Night Witches did take casualties. Of the roughly 400 women who served in the 588 Regiment over the course of the war, 32 were killed in action. That's an 8% fatality rate over 4 years of constant combat operations. For comparison, the average bomber crew in the US 8th Air Force had about a 20% chance of being killed. So the Night Witches despite flying obsolete planes with no protection, actually had better survival odds than American bomber crews in B-17 with armor and defensive guns. Why? The tactics, the darkness, the low altitude. The Germans simply couldn't develop effective countermeasures. One of the most famous Night Witch engagements happened in August 1942. A German fighter pilot finally managed to shoot down a Po-2 flown by Lieutenant Yekaterina Ryabova and her navigator Vera Belashova. The German pilot, who received his Iron Cross, reported that it took him 3 passes to hit the biplane. On his first 2 attempts, the Po-2 pilot executed such tight turns that he nearly stalled trying to follow. On the 3rd pass, he finally got a burst into the plane's fuel tank. The Po-2 exploded in flames. No parachutes. Both women died. When the regiment learned of their deaths, they painted Ryabova's plane number on the side of another aircraft and continued flying it. The Germans could kill individual pilots, but they couldn't stop the Night Witches. New pilots would simply take the places of the fallen and keep flying. The German soldiers on the ground, meanwhile, developed their own coping mechanisms. Some would try to sleep in shifts, so constant harassment wouldn't completely exhaust entire units. Others would dig deeper bunkers and shelters, trying to protect themselves from the small bombs, but nothing really worked. Because the Night Witches weren't trying to destroy entire divisions with massive bombing raids. They were trying to make German soldiers lose sleep, to keep them in constant fear, to destroy morale more than infrastructure. And it worked. German after-action reports from 1943 onward frequently mention exhaustion from nighttime harassment by the Nachthexen. Soldiers who couldn't sleep, units that couldn't rest and refit because every night brought more attacks, supply dumps that had to be constantly relocated, command posts that couldn't stay in one place. The Night Witches weren't winning the war by themselves, but they were making it significantly harder for the Germans to win. And they were doing it in planes that the Luftwaffe openly mocked as obsolete when they first encountered them. Behind the statistics and tactics were individual women, each with their own story of courage. Nadezhda Popova joined the Night Witches at age 19. She was a university student studying to be a pilot when the war started. Her brother was killed in the first months of the invasion. Her family's home was destroyed. She volunteered not just to fight, but to avenge. Over the course of the war, Popova flew 852 combat missions. Her plane was hit by German fire multiple times. Once, she counted 42 bullet holes in her aircraft after landing. She kept flying it. She was shot down once and survived, escaping through German lines back to Soviet territory. She married another pilot in her regiment. They'd see each other between missions, sometimes just for minutes before taking off again. After the war, Popova received the Hero of the Soviet Union Award, the USSR's highest military honor. She died in 2013 at age 91, one of the last surviving Night Witches. In interviews late in her life, she said the hardest part wasn't the combat. It was losing friends, watching other pilots not return from missions, knowing that tomorrow night you'd fly again over the same German guns that had just killed your best friend. Yevgenia Rudneva was a navigator in the regiment. She had a degree in astronomy. She literally navigated by the stars, using her scientific training to guide her pilot to targets in complete darkness with nothing but a compass and visual landmarks. Rudneva flew over 645 missions. She kept a diary throughout the war, documenting not just missions, but her thoughts, fears, and observations. On April 9, 1944, her plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire during a mission over Crimea. The Po-2 crashed and burned. Rudneva died at age 23. Her diary survived and was published after the war, providing one of the most detailed personal accounts of Night Witch operations. In one entry, she wrote about the moment before takeoff. You sit in the cockpit and your hands are shaking. Not from fear, but from cold and exhaustion. You've already flown 4 missions tonight. You know you're going to fly 3 more, and you think, if I die tonight, at least I died fighting. And then you start the engine. Irina Sabrova flew 1,008 combat missions, more than any other woman in history. Think about that number. 1,008 times. She climbed into an open cockpit wooden biplane and flew into German anti-aircraft fire. She survived the entire war without being shot down, though her aircraft was hit numerous times. After the war, she became a teacher. Imagine being a student in her history class, learning about World War II from a woman who flew more combat missions than almost anyone else in the entire war. Sabrova was asked in an interview what it felt like to be shot at every single night for years. She said, "After the first few dozen missions, you stop being afraid of dying. You just accept it might happen. Then you focus on the mission. The fear doesn't help you bomb accurately, so you put it away and do your job." That's the mentality that made the Night Witches so effective. Not fearlessness, controlled fear, professional determination even in the face of death. Katya Ryabova and Nadia Popova, not the Nadezhda Popova mentioned earlier, but another pilot with the same first name, were partners, pilot and navigator, best friends. They flew dozens of missions together, developing the kind of non-verbal communication that made them exceptionally effective. On one mission in 1943, their plane was badly damaged by ground fire. The engine was failing. The controls were damaged. They knew they couldn't make it back to their airfield. They had 2 choices: crash in German-occupied territory and be captured or killed, or try to reach Soviet lines. They flew their damaged plane, barely controllable, at treetop level through German positions, taking more ground fire until they crossed the front lines and crash-landed in a field held by Soviet forces. Both survived the crash. They were back flying within a week, in a new aircraft. The regiment painted their old plane number on the replacement, just like they did with all fallen or damaged aircraft. The plane number kept flying, even if the specific aircraft didn't. Then there's the story of the youngest Night Witch. Zoya Malkova joined the regiment at age 17 by lying about her age. She was too young to legally serve in combat, but she forged her documents and made it through training. Her commanders discovered the truth after she'd already flown several missions. They could have sent her home. Instead, they let her keep flying. She'd already proven herself. Malkova flew 45 missions before she was killed when her plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire in 1943. She was 18 years old. After her death, her mother received a letter from Malkova's commander explaining that her daughter had died a hero flying against the fascist invaders. The mother wrote back, saying she was proud her daughter had served, but wished she'd known the truth about Zoya's age. She would have supported her daughter's decision to fight. This was the reality for many Night Witch families, mothers and fathers losing daughters, sisters losing sisters. But in the desperate defense of the Soviet Union, these losses were seen as necessary sacrifice. The Night Witches didn't just fly missions, they lived in conditions that were barely habitable. Their airfields were often just cleared fields near the front lines. They slept in tents or dugouts. They ate whatever food was available, often just bread, soup and tea. Sometimes they'd go days with minimal sleep, flying all night and spending the day maintaining aircraft, refueling and preparing for the next night's missions. The ground crews, all women, worked in conditions just as harsh as the pilots. They'd refuel and rearm planes in darkness, often under time pressure because pilots were waiting to take off for the next mission. They'd repair battle damage, patch bullet holes, replace damaged canvas and wood. They did this in freezing winter, in summer heat, in rain and mud. Without these women, the pilots couldn't fly. The regiment recognized this. Ground crew members received the same decorations as pilots because their contribution was just as essential. The physical toll on the pilots was immense. Flying in an open cockpit at high altitude in Russian winter caused frostbite. The noise from the engine, sustained for hours every night, caused hearing damage. The stress of constant combat operations led to exhaustion, weight loss, and psychological strain. Some pilots developed what we'd now call PTSD: nightmares, difficulty sleeping, hypervigilance, but there was no mental health support. You either kept flying or you didn't. Most kept flying. There was also the reality that they were women in a male-dominated military. Despite their combat record, many male Soviet officers treated them with condescension or outright hostility. When the Night Witches would land at military airfields for refueling or repairs, male pilots would sometimes mock them. "The girls are here with their sewing machines," referring to the sound of the Po-2 engines. The Night Witches learned to ignore this, or sometimes they'd respond by pointing out their combat records. "How many missions have you flown this week?" That usually ended the mockery. But the Soviet propaganda machine recognized the value of the Night Witches. They were perfect for morale purposes. Women defending the motherland, Soviet gender equality in action, underdogs defeating the technologically superior Germans. Soviet newspapers and radio broadcasts celebrated their achievements. The Night Witches were featured in propaganda posters and films. This had a double-edged effect. On one hand, it raised the regiment's profile and gave them some protection from discrimination within the military. On the other hand, it created pressure. They weren't just fighting for military objectives, they were symbols. If they failed, it would be seen as proof that women couldn't handle combat. This pressure to prove themselves constantly weighed on many of the pilots. By 1945, the Night Witches had flown over 30,000 combat missions. They dropped 23,000 tons of bombs on German positions. They'd participated in operations at Stalingrad, the Caucasus, the Crimea, Belarus, Poland, and finally Germany itself. 23 of the Night Witches were awarded Hero of the Soviet Union, the USSR's highest honor. The entire regiment was eventually designated Guards, an elite status in the Soviet military that recognized exceptional performance. When the war ended in May 1945, the Night Witches flew their final missions over Berlin. The same women who'd started the war flying over their own country, trying to stop the German invasion, ended it flying over the German capital in victory. But the end of the war didn't mean recognition in the way we might expect. When victory parades were held in Moscow, the Night Witches were not included. Soviet authorities decided that having women in military parades didn't fit the image they wanted to project. The male pilots flew over Red Square. The female pilots watched from the ground. This was the beginning of a pattern. In the years after the war, the Soviet Union emphasized traditional gender roles. Women were encouraged to return to domestic life, to have children, to support the rebuilding of the country. The Night Witches, who'd proven women could be effective combat pilots, were an inconvenient reminder that traditional roles weren't the only option. After the war, most Night Witches returned to civilian life. Some became teachers, engineers, doctors, using the education they'd received before the war. Others struggled to adjust. How do you return to normal life after flying 800 combat missions? After losing friends and nearly dying yourself repeatedly for years? Some Night Witches married and had families. Others remained single, bonded to their wartime experience in a way that made civilian relationships difficult. Many stayed in touch with each other, forming a veterans organization that met regularly. These gatherings were sometimes the only place they felt truly understood. But their story was gradually forgotten by the broader world. In the Soviet Union, World War II history focused on the massive battles, Stalingrad, Kursk, Berlin. Individual units, especially all-female units, received less attention. In the West, the story was almost completely unknown. When Americans and Europeans learned about World War II, they heard about D-Day, the Battle of Britain, the Pacific War. The Eastern Front was covered, but usually focused on major operations and famous generals. The Night Witches? Barely mentioned. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that their story began to receive serious attention. Historians started interviewing surviving night witches, documenting their experiences before they were lost. Books were written, documentaries were made, and people were shocked. These women had flown more combat missions than most male pilots in history, in planes that should have been death traps. Against one of the most advanced air forces in the world, and they'd succeeded. The Soviet Union had put women in combat roles out of desperate necessity, but these women had proven that gender was irrelevant to courage, skill, and effectiveness. They hadn't just participated in the war, they'd been genuinely effective combatants who terrorized German forces and contributed meaningfully to Soviet victory. Modern feminist historians have debated what the Night Witches represent. Were they examples of female empowerment? Or were they victims of Soviet propaganda, used and then discarded when they were no longer needed? The truth is probably both. These women volunteered to fight. They wanted to defend their country. Many of them explicitly said they chose combat duty, that they weren't forced. At the same time, they operated in a system that used them for propaganda purposes and then tried to erase them from history when it was convenient. But here's what's undeniable. They flew the missions. They dropped the bombs. They faced the anti-aircraft fire. Whether you see them as empowered volunteers or exploited propaganda tools, you can't deny their courage and effectiveness. They did something that military authorities in almost every other country said was impossible. Women proved they could fight in combat as effectively as men. Today, the Night Witches are finally receiving recognition. In Russia, there are monuments to the 588th Regiment. Schools are named after famous Night Witch pilots. Young girls learn about Nadezhda Popova and Yevgenia Rudneva, the way American children learn about Amelia Earhart. In 2013, a memorial was unveiled at the site of one of their wartime airfields. Surviving Night Witches attended, now in their 90s. One of them, when asked what she wanted young people to know, said, "We weren't heroes. We were just doing what needed to be done. But I'm glad people finally know we did it." The last surviving Night Witch, Yevdokia Nosal, died in 2020 at age 98. She'd flown 354 combat missions during the war. She spent her post-war life working as an engineer and rarely talked about her wartime service until late in life. When historians finally interviewed her in the 2000s, she provided crucial details about tactics and operations that had been lost. Her death marked the end of an era. All the Night Witches are now gone. We can't ask them questions anymore. We can't hear firsthand what it was like to fly into German anti-aircraft fire in a wooden biplane. But their story remains. 30,000 missions, 23,000 tons of bombs, years of nighttime terror inflicted on German forces, an Iron Cross bounty that was rarely collected because they were so hard to shoot down, and a legacy that proves courage has nothing to do with gender and everything to do with determination to fight for what you believe in. The Night Witches flew in planes that should have been death traps. They faced an enemy that was technologically superior in every measurable way. They operated in conditions, nighttime, low altitude, extreme weather that made survival unlikely. And yet, they not only survived, they thrived. They turned obsolete equipment into an advantage. They developed tactics that made them nearly impossible to counter. They inflicted psychological damage on German forces that exceeded the physical damage from their small bombs. The German soldiers' fear of the Nachthexen was real. The automatic Iron Cross for shooting down a Po-2 was real. These weren't propaganda inventions. These were responses to a genuine threat that the Wehrmacht couldn't neutralize. In the end, the Night Witches prove something that military establishments around the world have often been reluctant to accept. Effectiveness in combat isn't about physical strength or gender. It's about courage, skill, tactical intelligence, and determination. These women had all of those qualities. They just needed someone to give them a chance to prove it. The Soviet Union gave them that chance out of desperation. But once given, the Night Witches seized it and became one of the most effective harassment forces in military history. The Night Witches are just one of countless untold stories from the Eastern Front, the largest and deadliest theatre of World War II, where most of the war was actually fought and won. If you want more stories like this, the tactics, the courage, and the forgotten heroes that shaped the war, subscribe to Forgotten Front. Next video, Wojtek, the soldier bear, the 500-pound bear that was officially enlisted in the Polish army, had his own rank and serial number and carried ammunition during combat. Yes, this actually happened. What other lesser-known WWII stories should I cover? Drop your suggestions in the comments,